Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Pilates Hour. I'm so happy to be here with Christy Idavoy.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here with Shelly Power.
Well, this is going to be a great webinar. It's one of Christy's and my favorite topics is to talk about cueing. So, Christy, I don't know if you get asked this question often, but I certainly do. Hey, could you tell me how to cue this particular exercise? How do you cue the swan, or how do you cue a rollover? And as you guys know, my favorite answer is, well, it depends on a few things. Have you been asked that question maybe once or twice before?
I was about to say just a little bit. And we definitely had a lot of fun with this one and this, even the title of this webinar, this idea of the one right cue, which is, rhetorical and funny, and invites us to it's a funny thing, right? Where it's like, oh, how do we find the one best one? And it opens up this awareness of realizing that it all really depends, and that there's so much that we can discuss and talk about. And yeah, oftentimes too, it's so helpful. And the students will ask, can I hear you cue this, or how would you cue this person? Because maybe the student or I've been successful cueing it in a certain way for a number of different individuals, and it's worked just fine. And then suddenly I have this one individual where my kind of go-to way of explaining or cueing something just isn't working. So those are those moments where the students really come over and are just kind of like, how else could I say this? Like, what do you mean there's so many ways that I could describe the same thing?
Right. And it really is. I mean, there are so many things that go into that learning process of, you start to get an idea of this information works most of the time. Like, this is a pretty go-to for most people most of the time. And then you have your reserve cues that you don't use all the time, but you build your repertoire of those too, and you start to know, okay, I think I need to cue this in a different way. And you dip into this other bucket of cues that, again, we don't have to use all the time. And you do start to, if you're in the teacher training now, and I know we have a lot of seasoned professionals joining us who've been teaching for many, many years. And we also have people who are just coming in to maybe the second or third module of their teacher training, and they've never done this before. So rest assured that you will build your repertoire of cues. And we're going to, give you some ideas today about how to go about this, how to practice this, how to, start thinking about delivering the information. And I guess one of the things that I really think about is what what are the goals that I want, right? We develop goals from our problems from a screening or an assessment, and we know what the client needs to work on. But we also, as teachers, need to have our goals of what what do I want the person to experience. So let's talk a little bit about that, maybe, Christy, of what are potential outcomes as teachers, and what does it really mean to be a teacher?
Yeah, so much of it is being clear with our intention of what you're getting at, of what is my objective as the teacher. Um, what is it that I want to convey? What kind of experience am I guiding? Because when we cue, it's funny. It also makes me think of the word hue, of like giving something a tone, of like painting a picture of something. I've been playing with a lot is realizing that we're basically storytelling through movement with our cues. And what's the energy of that story? How do I want to convey that? And again, to just contextualize this huge, massive range of years of experience of maybe I'm thinking about a teacher training, maybe I've been teaching for 30 years. And something that I feel is so rich about this topic, and that has allowed us to have conversations that maybe we wouldn't have had so deliberately and consciously, because we were preparing for this day, for this webinar, but realizing that even after so many years of doing movements that are seemingly the same, we're still sharing like, oh, I've been playing with this cue, or I've been playing with this way of thinking about doing this movement. And having the awareness that the repertoire of cues is a living repertoire. It's a living thing that continues to expand and grow and evolve. And that whenever we can never do something identically the same way 2 times. So we're always a little different. The experience is always a little bit different. So tuning into that, having, and it's something again that we develop, that we become more sensitive to, more aware, more appreciative of. But so much of, why are we saying what we're saying? Having that clear intention is going to inform what we say and how we say it, right? So the why, getting clear on your why, is huge. And so then it's like this whole experience of, well, how do I do that? What goes into that? Well, the group, right? So it might be a client that you have that's a one-on-one, and you've had the opportunity to even assess and have very specific goals for one person, which is very different than working with the high school lacrosse team, or right, which is another kind of specific need. Or and I think also when we say, what I mean by a specific need is that it's, again, if there's a very clear goal that this group has that makes them a group. Sometimes we don't have that. Sometimes we're teaching at the YMCA, and it's just we would just want to provide a general positive movement experience for a very general public that we might not have much information about, other than what we can see and take in that moment.
Right. One of my first teaching experiences when I moved to Miami was teaching in one of the big hotels on Miami Beach. And not only was it with a group of people that I saw once a week for an hour, it was mostly hotel guests, people I would never see again. And I have no idea who's coming back next time. And it was a real challenge for me to start to come up with, again, I think of sometimes these like buckets or bags of things, or, our tool chest has some different compartments in it. And I really had to come up with some almost neutral cues that could work for just about any population, and thinking of people of different ages. And we would have very young people in the class, and I'd have, someone who was also 80 years old who had never done Pilates before. And it was, I had to be very careful about, did I speak to the teenager? Did I speak to the older adult? Did I speak to the much older adult? And how did I communicate with everybody? And that's where I kind of started with cues that were kind of just average and neutral, that kind of met everybody, nothing very extravagant in any direction. I didn't speak like a dancer. I didn't speak as if the people in my classes were movers or not movers. They just became kind of the cues. But I think that is something, really, what you bring up, it's really appropriate to find out who are these people in your class pretty quickly, so that you can, if there could be a common language there, you could certainly tap into that, or know that you actually need to keep it a little bit more generic until you start to understand who that is. And you made me think, when you were talking about this, the why and the how. And I think there is, and I've heard this word used a lot recently, of curiosity. So I am super curious how I can do what I need to do for a group of people, or a certain client, an individual. And I know what my goals are, which are also their goals. And if you've ever listened to the Pilates Hour before, you know that the client's goals of what they want to do. What do they want to participate in? What is the activity that they need to do? That really should be front and center of how we're determining what we're going to do in a session. And then I have to get curious about how am I going to do those things? And how do I communicate with the client to accomplish these goals? So if you're curious and you really put the client or the class, the other individuals that you're teaching really front and center, then it becomes a lot less about the cue and a lot more about the person, right? Or the people that you're teaching. And so that I think is something that if we continue to do that, then we already are, we're 3/4 of the way there, I would say, because then we're already thinking about how we're going to say something, why we're going to say something. Is it important, or could you just leave it for a moment and go after something that's more important? So I think that's great advice, Christy, that you're talking about the why and the how.
Yeah. And, I love this bit. And I remember when we, a few years ago, we were suddenly teaching so much virtually. And I remember jumping on with you on a phone call, and we were, really talking about this curiosity bit, as the teacher, like encouraging, like how do we bring curiosity to the classroom? um because when you're listening, oftentimes you can't, do a class at home on a video. And I mean, I suppose you could. It's not going to be the best experience to have your head turned the whole time towards a screen, or a tablet even, or a phone, right? So we're really relying on what's being said. So thinking about how we cue the class to encourage that curious attitude. And then what do we ask them to do? Sorry, what do we ask them to do? It's like, how do we practice this element of curiosity to make it more tangible, like a thing to do? And it really goes back to observation, right? Which is what we've talked about so much, is that based on what I see. So even your example of teaching in like a vacation environment, or we're not going to see people again, just based on what I see, where am I, right? So am I in a desert? Am I on a beach? What are some things that like if everyone is in a group together, there is something in common. And so becoming observant as the teacher, to very practical, to think, okay, these are some elements that are common to all of us. And then the really obvious things that we talk about as being in common, of like my body in space, right? So where's the pelvis and where's the head, and then building the relationships of the things that we observe, right? So are we all wanting to walk in the sand because we happen to be, I don't know, somewhere on a beach? Or did I actually get to evaluate someone, and I know because they've told me that they're interested in beach volleyball, and so the sand again is relevant, right? So not only does it inform how we might speak about things and direct ourselves towards that group or individual, but also what exercises or what aspects of different movements we might choose to focus on because they're relevant. So that, right, it's like this process, this continuous process of observing what is the goal, what is the environment, and then the relevance of what I'm teaching to that goal, environment, need, desire. So we talked earlier too, but before we went live, about what is the role of the teacher. So yeah, right, we've said like creating an experience, creating a space, but also the role of the teacher is very much like a guide. And in order to guide an experience or someone, you need to make sure that you're being understood. And we need to make it so simple. And the more we become really good at observing, the simpler it gets, because you start to be able to tell by someone's eyes, their face, a physical gesture, right? Like most of communication is nonverbal. So if we're also observing, is what how is it landing? How is it being received, right? Um, that that's very important. And it goes back to that idea of the more curious I am, the better I'm going to be as an observer. And then based on what I observe, I continue to layer on information.
Right. I love that idea of being a guide, and just thinking about beliefs and, all of us, each of us has a history with a teacher that we loved who was so amazing, or the teacher that we disliked the most, least favorite teacher. They were mean, they were this or that. And when we're kids, and I suppose we're kids until we, at least get through our bachelor's program, right? Maybe going into a master's or a PhD program. Sometimes it's that it's like, oh, they were not nice to me, or they weren't, or they were really nice to me. But we don't always recognize, I think, what they are doing. And hopefully, the teachers now that I know really are trying to make change in what their students know, whether it's learning history or a skill or whatever it might be. I think the way that we go about educating people is very different now. So it's not just read a book and memorize some things for the test, but more it's like, how are we embodying the information? And then how are we as teachers creating change in the knowledge of our clients? Or in our case, because we're both Pilates educators, how are we creating change in what our students start to understand? And then and they tell two people and they tell two people, because they now are the teachers that are creating change in their clients. And I think one of the things, because sometimes we think, oh, they have to be able to have more range of motion. That's the change I want, or more control, or more of something. And from kind of growing up in the physical therapy clinic, there were a lot of instances where we would be teaching somebody, and that was the most that that person could do today, because they had some injury or pathology, and they couldn't actually do any more. They couldn't take on either more variations or more different exercises. But there was always an opportunity to give them just a little bit more information about next time. So here we are today. And as you progress, we're going to work toward these things. And I think that's also it's very interesting and stimulating to people, for most people, because they want to know what's next. They also want to know that what's next is not too much. When I used to teach our introductory classes at the Polestar studio in Miami, I really tried to pitch it to, because these were people who had probably never done Pilates before. And it was half the group was thinking, oh my gosh, I hope we don't do the same thing every single class, because that's going to get really boring. And the other half of the people are saying, oh my gosh, I hope we do the same thing for a few times, because otherwise I'm going to be completely overwhelmed. And we know, in the Pilates repertoire, of course, you can do both of those things at the same time, which is wonderful. But that's really where I started to think of, how can create change? How can we create interest? And how do we create that curiosity in the clients, instead of the old teaching model, which is, I'm just going to tell you what to do, and you have no say in it. You can't make adjustments for your own body. I'm certainly not going to tell you any of those things, because I want you, to be reliant on me to just tell you things. And that's the thing that I really don't want. I want you to go away from my classes or a session and have more information than you did when you came in, that allows you to then continue to practice Pilates or whatever movement you do, uh, every day, every moment of every day, because we know a couple of Pilates sessions a week is certainly not enough to create really long lasting change. Um, Let's talk a little bit about, I think let's talk about some of the things that, since we're talking about cueing, what what different things can cueing improve? What are the things that you think about when you're teaching of things that could change or improve with your cues?
Yeah, and even just it was coming up while you were talking, is this idea of cueing again has everything to do with communication, right? And there's all of these layers, and it's almost like Russian dolls of communication, where there's external, and then the external, because basically cueing is a series of, it's giving information, and then there's a lot of feedback, because again, based on what I observe, I'm figuring out how to offer this information, how to cue, as it were. So it's the environment, the student, the goals, the desires, the beliefs are informing the way I'm going to communicate. So I'm basically offering feedback based on the information that I have, right? Based on that observation. So the first layer is really a lot of self-discovery, especially early on, and when we're working with individuals that potentially they're just like, I think it's funny because like we're act normal, like just whatever you do, act normal, and the normal people. And what we mean by that is, what I mean by that is that they're not necessarily individuals that are contemplating the relationship of their tailbone with the relationship of their crown. If you're working with the movement population, well, then that's going to be different. But if we bring it into that environment you were describing of like the Polestar Center, physical therapy clinics, people that come in a lot of times because they've heard that this can help them feel better. And the first thing is really this moment of self-discovery, of coming into relationship with myself, and that external information creates a heightened awareness about my internal awareness of where I am in space, pausing to notice, how did that feel? Even so many of our cues, and we have this very much in common, is cueing, like using an open-ended question as a cue to stimulate that kind of curious reflection. How did that feel today? What did I notice that maybe would have been different today? And we can certainly play with that as teachers. If we're, I just think of any exercise that we can guide and direct from different body parts. So, if I'm always cueing, bridging, thinking about the tailbone and the back of the body and the sacrum and the spine and the way it relates to the mat, that's great. Well, maybe the next day or the other class, I'm going to cue it thinking more about the direction of the knees and the length across the front of the body or the seams of the body. What are the feet doing, right? So I think oftentimes when we're learning, we're realizing like, oh my God, there's more and there's more. And there's so many ways to think about this. And I can cue organs or bones or right. And we want to share it all. And that can overheat the system. And I know I've certainly received that feedback of like, great information, maybe a little less at a time, and it's like, save it. You don't have to give it all up. And getting comfortable with silence. And something that was coming up for me too, while you were talking about this whole, like, what is cueing and communication and receiving information. And I've got so many anecdotal stories about this, because again, like when we were preparing for this, I was acknowledging how it's such a reward and thank you for this topic that we get to verbalize and talk about experiences that we've been accumulating for decades. Like, how many hours of our lives have we spent thinking about how our earlobes line up over our heel bones? You know what I mean? Like these relationships. So when we receive information, when we receive a cue, that moment of like, no, I'm not, that's not true. I am doing that. Why are you asking me to do that? I'm already doing that. And how that process of self-reflection, self-discovery, how that really can teach us or offer us an opportunity to be humble, to say, maybe I'm not doing what I thought I was doing. Maybe I need to pause and wow, there's this other vantage point, and realize that there's an infinity of perspectives and vantage points to observing experience and communicating experience, which again, reiterating that this is a living thing that is constantly morphing and growing as we are. And the more we think about what is appropriate, what is that sport, what is that, where did you come from? You know, we've had the blessing and privilege, right, thanks to Polestar and to get to have to share cueing and this work in a variety of different cultures, of, you know, learning about the difference of personal space from just sharing with different people from different cultures that might not even speak the same language, but we speak Pilates movement and we can communicate that way and start sharing and even learning from each other. But just appreciating how the more we advance and this kind of what makes it a higher kind of level or vibration is really that ability to come down and approach it with that child mind, where you said, well, maybe that childhood learning stops. Maybe it's an attitude more than an age that we can continue to revisit and say, I'm just going to lie down on the reformer and pretend I've never done it before. And I'm going to wait to be cued and guided into it.
That is.
That would be amazing. And it sounds great, but I know that it's an effort because it's like, no, I know it. I've done it. I know it.
I think, and what you brought up is so important of this. It is constantly changing, and we get to constantly change. And I sometimes hear this from students, or, you know, I've heard it in other disciplines too, of, like you just said, I already know that. You know, I did my exercise checkoff, right? So the verification that you can, you know, properly do the exercises, or properly teach the exercises. I did it. It's like, okay, good for you. What does that mean? And can you see how this is the beginning? Like, we're novices at this until we start to become advanced beginners, and then eventually we're competent. And really, and Brent mentions this often, of really spending time at a novice level or an advanced beginner level, where it's okay to not know everything. And then as someone progresses, you know, we start to get toward even that expert level, there is in that, I think, an inherent need and want and desire for growth and desire for more information and discovery. And many people um, who get that far, I mean, the thought of something being stagnant, or I already know it. Yeah, I know that. It's like, well, okay, good. I'm glad you know that. And now things have changed, right? It's already, you know, by the time you know it, it's time to start, you know, looking again at it and having a new thought about it, and a new discovery, and a new feeling, or a new um, moment with a client, where a client has a new experience with something, and it's like, wow, I never knew that before. And so when we can put ourselves in that place of constant learning, and really to say, yeah, I'm confident with what I know, and I'm confident that I will learn more, and be open to that. And I think that's something, that's an attitude. I think that's that growth mindset of I honor what I know, and I honor what I don't know yet. And that's a great place. And you also mentioned a strategy in that self-discovery. And as teachers, one of the tools that I use, and I first learned about this from Alistair Greetham, one of our faculty members in the UK, of this idea of contrast. So try it like this, try it like that. And if you've ever worked with me, or if you've ever done a session or a training or a workshop, it's one of my go-tos, because it is so apparent. And I was teaching my weekly mat class this week, and we got on the topic of the 100 and cueing the 100 and what's working during the 100 and how are we breathing and all these different topics. And one of the comments was about having been cued to, really tighten the abdominals and really use the abdominal muscles. And how when we do that, if I literally do that and I tighten my abdominals, and I invite you all to do it right now, tighten your abdominal muscles as much as you can and try to breathe. It's next to impossible. It's also, though, really an important feeling so that you can say, oh, wow, it's almost impossible to breathe when I have all of my muscles engaged, which I was told to engage my powerhouse to do that, or to engage my abdominals, or really draw my navel to my spine. And now I realize I actually can't breathe when I do that. So, what can I do instead? If the goal now is not to tighten my abdominals, but the goal is to maintain a body position for a certain amount of time and breathe, how do I do that? Let me think about that. And it starts to put the responsibility back into each of us as clients or movers, and takes it away from the teacher just telling us things. So I need to learn in my own body about today and how I could do the 100, which might be very different from yesterday or 2 weeks from now, and really have that ownership. Right? Brent talks a lot about self-efficacy. We talk about internal locus of control, internal awareness. How do I develop that? And I think that is from my teachers, right? And my own curiosity saying, this is the goal that I want from you. How do you do that? I find myself cueing this a lot when we're doing a lot of the prone work. So do this thing. Now maintain your body position and do the next thing. Maintain your body position and do something, or move your body and do something in the way that works for your body with this thing that you're paying attention to. So maybe in the 100, it is maintaining the shape of the torso, right? I wouldn't want to lower my legs and have my spine arch. That's not really part of it. I want to maintain the body position. And then how do I do all these other things? How do I breathe for a longer amount of time? How do I do these things? So I think that we as teachers can really provide almost the permission to our clients to, within reason, figure it out for themselves. Like, how would you do that if this is the goal? How do you do that in your body? I can give you some basic tips and alignment. Oh, I can see your legs are too far out on the 100. Why don't you bend your legs? Or here's a prop behind your upper back so you can feel what it's like to be in the position. But ultimately, you've got to figure it out. And I'm just going to give you some information that's going to help you to do that.
I love that, because you're really describing this question that we receive a lot of: where do we get our cues from? Where do you find these cues?
Book of cues.
And you just yeah, I know, right? That's a book that I have pending. The book of cues, the book of verbal cues. But that's the place. The place is that laboratory. And a few weeks ago, I was in New York, and I actually taught a workshop where in the lab we played with that idea of, like, now I'm gonna cue something one way, and then I'm gonna cue it a different way. Let's come up and share what was different about those experiences in your movement, understanding that there is no good or bad or right or wrong. There is that contrast that you're discussing, right? And it's the exploration of that contrast is where you find your cues, is where you find your ideas around movement. Yeah, I think that is so important. And and of course, part of it, again, there's a huge just like we said, that it's something that's living and growing and evolving. So it really is an infinite kind of process, because as you move towards becoming an expert and spending a couple of decades studying one thing, or, developing awareness around something. The only way you continue to progress is by continuously dropping into that learner's mind, that growth mindset, that beginner mindset. And it's that place of, where do we actually begin? When we begin is making it very simple, making it very obvious. What are things that, again, like you said, in the beginning, this idea of having kind of a neutral or universal language, like we all have a head, shoulders, the space in between, the pelvis, the sacrum, that kind of basic anatomical references that are relevant to everyone, with the body, right? And then become super important and start to take on different meaning as you develop this relationship with them, of being aware of the difference when we're delivering information, of how I'm going to deliver that information to someone or a group that, like, maybe it's their first ever class. They've never done any kind of movement before, versus now I'm going to work with someone who, it might be their first class with me, my first class with them, but they're a super seasoned, I always think of like the Cirque du Soleil, the gymnasts, the people that are acrobats and fly through space. How might I relate? I still am going to mention the top of the head, I'm sure. I'm still going to mention length and the axis, right? The axis that run through the body and their relationships. But I'm going to have that awareness that they're going to have different meaning for these different people, based on their experience and based on mine, right? So again, I think it's this conversation around cueing is the bit about observe and be curious, so that as a teacher, you're also able to learn, because that's the only way that, right? Because again, what is the purpose? Why do we cue? Why do we do this? One of the big reasons is to create change, to create meaningful change. And like you said, Shelly, it's not just about, I'm going to change their range of movement today in this particular joint, but they may have a change in their understanding of it, the way they felt in that body, in their body that day. Yeah, it's a really beautiful process, and one that invites us, really. I love what you said about giving enough information also, and this kind of contrast cueing of, go ahead and try it. Now do the opposite, try that. Because it's a strategy to put the responsibility, and I don't mean responsibility of like, you have to do something, but that you're able to respond, thinking of responsibility as the ability to respond, which also reminds me of Alistair, right? The way he breaks down and looks at words this way, so that they can also have enough information and decide to make a change one way or the other for themselves that we may not even be aware of.
Their body, they have to be, they're responsible for themselves, because we're not going to be with them, right? And movement and all of these, interacting with our environment is all mostly spontaneous. It needs to be able to happen, and we need our clients to be able to be spontaneous in their movement. They shouldn't be waiting for us to say, oh, remember to do such and such. We will do those things, but I challenge my mat class. It is definitely, this is what I want. What also do you want? What are you paying attention to? What's your focus in this movement? It's great what I'm telling you. I have some knowledge and I'll share it, but also, what about you? What's your responsibility in this conversation of me being the teacher or the facilitator and you being the mover? And I want people to think on their own. I don't want any client of mine, to to ever be just waiting for the next cue because they don't know what to do. I've shared this story a lot of, when I was a fairly new teacher, I wanted to make sure that I shared information with my clients because one of my greatest fears would they would go to another teacher, maybe they're on holiday or they saw a different teacher in our studio and the comment, "Oh, well, Shelly never told me that. Shelly never shared that information. Oh, she never said that either." I was so, I was so aware of, I at least wanted to give a good amount of information so that the client um, could make smart decisions. And that kind of leads into, there's a question about the balance between over and under queuing. And it's such a great question because as much as we, in the very beginning, especially when you're learning something new, we do tend to over cue because we want to practice what we know and we want to make sure that other people know that we know stuff, right? So I'm going to say a whole bunch of things because I want you to know, look how many things I know. And the poor client is like, "Oh dear, can you just can you be quiet for a second?" And then that brings up my phrase that I've used now for a couple of years, which is if you're counting, you're not teaching. Right. So it goes the other way too. I might cue, everything. And you mentioned it, Christy, of, could you just not say quite so much and have some time for me to process what you're saying? And then there are the teachers that don't really say anything and they count and five and four and three and two and I'm thinking, wow, that was like 7 or 8 seconds of prime time that you could have been saying something, right? So that's something that goes through my mind. And it's normal for us at times to say too much, right? But I think that's where when you keep bringing back the idea of observing, being observant and reading the room, reading the class, reading the person, you start to know when people are a bit overwhelmed. They're not really taking in the information anymore. So that's our job to notice that as much as we can. And one of the things, and this is something that can help everybody, and it's one of our assignments, and it's probably one of my favorite assignments, is to record yourself. So
Mm.
put your camera up, put your phone, back of the room somewhere, and record yourself teaching. And it is incredible the amount that you will learn about your body language, your position, teachers who stand with their arms crossed all the time, teachers who are, in with the clients a lot. Are you too close to the clients? Are you never close to the client? And of course, there's personal preference and differences there. Do you say the same thing over and over and over? Or are your cues really related to what's happening now with that client? And then I would like you to put your feet on the bar. And then I would like you to press back. And then I would like you to bend your knees. And then I would like you to not have as many repeated phrases and words. And you mentioned something early about this idea of, doing it right or being perfect and those things. There's not one of us that doesn't say repetitive words. We will, we are all human. So it's not about not doing these things ever, but what are you doing most of the time? What's your 80-20 rule? What are you doing most of the time? And what are you doing that happens every once in a while that's not a big deal? But if it happens all the time, it becomes a big deal. And you're really losing valuable time that you could be giving more information to the client or to the class. I don't know if you want to talk about that idea of overqueuing or
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really a practice of presence. And the more present we are, the more we're going to notice if it's too much or if it's not enough. I think also the deeper your understanding of the demands of a movement, of a body position, of like, what are some of those important things that can be said in 1 or 2 words? So, thinking of this idea or this recipe of setting up the body position. So, is the exercise supine? Is it in prone? Is it in side lying, etc.? Setting up the body position, bringing awareness to what's relevant. So what bony landmarks do you want their awareness to come to, or things in the room, whatever it is. And now what are they going to do? What's the action? And let them move and allow people to move to get it going. To Shelly's, point, like she's constantly saying, we all need a first few goes of anything. Like allow people to just get going. Then again, observe and start layering on some information. And again, the more that I understand that if I'm going to hold a chest lift position, if I'm setting up the 100, to continue with that example, the series of 5, the abdominal 5, right? Any of that. Well, I know that pressing the ribs back into the ground, reaching the crown of the head up, that's really going to help support that feeling of what am I standing into? What has to press down? Because I've been in that position long enough to know that if I'm not conscious of that combination of pressing back and reaching up and around, my neck is going to get tired. And because I'm aware of that, I'm probably also going to say, take a break when you need it. Curl back up when you're ready. And I love the, and now I want you to, and now you're going to, and again, we're super aware of it because we do it, eliminating that, and being very clear and succinct and efficient also with language, and I love the exercise. It's funny, as I don't love it at all, but it's because it's so humbling and challenging to watch myself teach, that it is very powerful and uncomfortable tool to have to listen and watch. And and especially with things that are floating around in the internet now, they just kind of are there for forever. When students say, oh, I've been watching you on Pilates Anytime for so many years, and I've noticed how your teaching has changed. And it's like, oh, like you become, but again, it's an opportunity to have grace with ourselves and to really call in a higher level of presence and maturity, because it does make you feel embarrassed and awkward and, oh my God, what did I say? And I did that thing again, and now you're gonna, and gonna's not even a word, right? Whatever it is. But that we keep observing that, and that we're thinking about, how are we matching? Is it congruent? We talk about all these concepts of alignment and congruency in our joints and our body, and they're also it's all relationship, so the same way I want my ball and socket to have congruency, I want to see my students and my own cueing and observe that. Does it feel aligned with the energy? Did someone come in really exhausted and I've on my 3rd cup of coffee and I'm just like bouncing off the walls, and there's not a matching of energy? When I match the energy, I do that in order to then be able to facilitate another layer of communication, which in this context is about change. And again, we're not talking about change radically, a movement in that very moment, but it's meaningful. And what makes it meaningful is that, oh yeah, I never thought of it that way, or I feel better. I feel lighter. Why do you feel better? What do you feel? I feel like my breathing is a little different, or I feel happier. Whatever it is, I think that that's very, very, very key, very high on what are the important things, is to notice, is it meaningful? Is the time that we're spending communicating with ourselves and with our students, is it meaningful? And we use so many tools, but basically we can dissect them into two categories of cueing that we talk about so much in our training, is direct cueing and indirect cueing. And I love Shelly's point of like, how often does it need to go to indirect? Is the indirect meaningful? Is it purposeful? Act like a butterfly, is it meaningful or not? What, now you're the sun. Okay, well, maybe it is meaningful in that moment of like, I need to radiate and really reach out reach rays of light out of my extremities, and the sun image can help. But, we were talking about, as we were preparing, like the, conveying shapes with an image, conveying a texture with an image, a tempo, how, this even, oh my gosh, a picture speaks 1,000 words, the cliche. The picture really does speak 1,000 words. So choose them wisely. And then again, always have a space where you can be creative and curious and explore and try those things on, because again, we're really applying the scientific method, right? We have a hypothesis, an educated hypothesis. I think that this could go this way. Let me test it. Let me gather some data. Maybe I'll test it on a number of different individuals or groups, get some feedback. What are the findings? What happened? So that's why we call it a lab when we're labbing the exercises, because it really is an experiment. Yeah. And so we've done enough experiments where we can say, yeah, this has been pretty universal at this point. That doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. We might try that. And we're, and again, when we're in that continuous student mind, we're open to have that opportunity to say, oh my gosh, this quote unquote thing that I had categorized in my universal cueing toolbox suddenly was proved to not work. What a great experience, what a great moment. It makes me have to pause and go, wow, I never saw it that way. Thank you for giving me this extra layer of perspective and understanding, because I don't know it all, right? I don't, and it's the more we know, the more we study something, the more we realize how little we actually know, especially when it comes to movement science, right? Which is alive and changing, as we've said.
Different for every single person. Like, it is just, it's similar, but again, our reality, each one of us, our own reality is drastically different than the person next to us. And so I think that's so important. And it's, right now it's really, poignant, I guess, is that we have, just in the schoolhouse here on the property, we have Eric Franklin teaching a course right now. And, he has really brought imagery and communication through imagery and metaphor, to so many different people. I remember when I first met Eric, which was years and years ago, and he was doing work at dance medicine conferences and with dance companies, and also with like such and such bank. And they would, or the office of, some attorney or whoever, different people, very pedestrian, not dancers or performing artists. And he was bringing this information of how we really do communicate through images and metaphors. It's how we communicate. And so I think we can make it, as you said, we can go more direct, very clear, and use our imagery wisely. And my famous one of, okay, pretend you're a flower. And if everybody, please don't do this because it'll overwhelm the chat, but if everybody put in what flower were you thinking about, however many people are on, we'd probably have that many different flowers, because I was unclear. I didn't give much context to it, and it probably wasn't really relevant of, pretend you're a flower. How can we use those cues, though, our imagery cues, to really change, like you said, texture and tempo, quality? Those are the things that we're trying to enhance with people. and not so much just, push back and forth or, that was good or bad. And really not, I would say that none of the human movement is wrong, right? I love this when I'm teaching something like sidekick and people are, they're so strict with their body because they've been told your body should never move and you should never rotate and you should never do these things. And it's like, well, you're going to be a very funny looking person walking down the street if you don't have reciprocal movement between your trunk and your lower extremities through the pelvis. So is it really wrong? Or is it just not what we want right now, right? Is it what the exercise is, or it's what the intention of the exercise is today? Or is it that it's just wrong? That's wrong. You should never do it. And I would say most things there's really nothing wrong. It's just, is it what we want right now? So today's lesson is about doing this. Let's see if we can all do this. Maybe tomorrow we'll do the exact opposite. And let's see how that is. And that again, that goes back to that idea of contrast. And I guess one of the big things too, and this goes back to Brent's, when he did his dissertation, and we were looking at, movement and um, locus of control, and are we really, in our own bodies, is what is our belief around movement and what are our clients' beliefs? And there's a question about in the chat about this like deep release with movement exploration and breath and the somatics of it. And I don't know the exact what Lisa is asking about of what type of a release, but I will tell you that, and maybe it's not a release, but it's a change in perspective. Is I didn't think I could do something, and now I can do it. And I have had many, many clients who were convinced that because of pain, because of something that someone told them, because of just not knowing how to do it, that they had a very deep belief that they could not do something. And I have had, great times of being really curious, like, okay, I bet we can get to this point. And they do. And that's a huge moment. So thank you for asking that, Lisa. We could probably share 100 stories of those things, but to me, it relies kind of, it's in the belief system. So, but being mindful of the time, Christy, we just have a minute or two left. Is there anything to wrap up with that um, that we either haven't said yet, or just to reiterate in terms of cueing?
Yeah, just express gratitude. Thank you to the community. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Polestar. And again, just remembering that it's a very vast topic, and to stay curious, to keep observing, and to challenge yourself to contextualize things. So if you find yourself wanting to look for the right or the wrong, or, the good or the bad, or even feeling, I liked that, I didn't like it, just go that extra layer and ask yourself why. Why was it good? Why didn't you like it? And keep on unraveling that, because it is in that space where we find the understanding of the human body and the human experience, which speaks to the somatic aspect, which is something that I'm incredibly passionate and interested in. And that's a huge topic because it gets into energy medicine. And it's like a portal, right? And the way we get in there is through the observation, is sidekick. The reason the body starts to move, there can be many reasons. You won't know them unless you pause to observe and figure out, oh, did I run out of movement? And so the movement's traveling up my body. Is there a lack of awareness? Is there a lack of practice, etc.? Right? We're adapting. We're constantly adapting to what we practice, whether we're conscious about it or not. So the more awareness you can bring to the practice, the more in control you're going to be of what you're adapting to, of what person we're constantly becoming. So we can choose who and what we're becoming through awareness, through observation.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to put it. And And I would say too, is it's whatever happens, it's okay too. I hear a lot of people wanting the best cues and the most cues and the right cue. And it's, it's okay to not have the right cue. And it's okay to maybe not know what to say next. And that might be an opportunity to check in with the client or the class and say, what are you observing? How would you describe this? And then you can learn from them. So please, everybody, stay curious in your teaching. Thank you all so much for coming, for joining us, for joining Christy and me to talk about this. And we will see you next time.